In this video, we're going to concentrate on if statements. So if statements are one of the fundamental coding constructs that are provided to us by pretty much every programming language out there. Any programming language that you will run into as a software developer is going to have some form of if statement. If we remember back to one of our previous videos, remember we went through a decision tree like this one right here, where we have an initial question we need to ask. It results in a Boolean answer, so a yes or a no, and then a resulting action, or else a resulting question that also results in a Boolean result, so a true or false. What we're going to do is we're going to take this little decision tree that we have right here, and we're going to convert it into if-else statements, and we are going to break them down so that we can learn about if statements and how they work in programming to work through Boolean logic. So how this control structure helps us with Boolean logic. So if statements. If statements are really quite simple once you get the hang of it. Now, if you don't get it right at the beginning, or if it kind of confuses you, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Replay the video, go through it again, read some documentation, get online, go to Stack Overflow, go to Mozilla's developer network, so developer.neumont.org, and read about it. If you still have problems, make sure you go talk to your instructor so they can help walk you through if statements. They're fundamental. You need to know them. They can be a little tricky, so if they're hard at first, don't take that as a bad sign. Just get some help. All right, so if statements. As we learned in previous videos, JavaScript has some reserved keywords for us, and one of those reserved words is the if reserved word. And if, all it is a reserved word that says we've got ourselves a condition that we want to check, and we want to verify whether or not this condition is true. If the condition is true, then we want to do something. So we start out with if, then we use ourselves some parentheses, and inside the parentheses is where our expression is going to end up. So here, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but you'll see examples like this in documentation and all over the place. Personally, I find examples like this to be more confusing to new developers than they really should be, or they're just a poor example for new developers because you're simply using the true value as the actual expression of the if statement, which means it's always going to execute. There's absolutely no reason for it not to execute. And then new developers ask themselves, well, why in the world would you do that? Because it's always going to execute. So why even check to see if it's true? Why not just put in the code that you want to have execute right down here? Let my var equal 10. And maybe what we want to have execute, let's move that down there, is my var, and then maybe we increment it by 1. And then if we do a console.out, console.log, and we put out my var, and then we go ahead and we run that code, we're going to go ahead and see an 11 down here. Well, because our example is really contrived and simplistic, by using true as the actual expression of the if statement, when the computer evaluates this true statement, it will always evaluate to true, which means the code inside of these curly braces will always execute no matter what. So that means every single time we run this code, my var will increment by 1, every single time, and therefore we will always get 1 as the output. 11, sorry. And no matter how many times we run this code, we are going to see down here, we get an 11. So this example, although it does show the essence of an if statement, don't let it confuse you. There's absolutely no reason ever in your programming, and this of course is my personal observation, that you would ever use true or false directly in an if statement, but you will run into that as an example in documentation, which can cause confusion. So let's use a better example. So let's go back to what we were doing inside of our decision tree. So should I X? And when I went over the decision tree, I spoke about gaming being a common decision that students have to make. I mean, if you like computers, you usually like gaming. And then it comes down to, should I game or should I do my homework? We always hope you choose your homework, but sometimes it can be a rather emotional decision based on how stressed out you are. So let's go ahead and use that as our example. So let's wipe out this code really quick. And let's use this decision tree as our example. So we need a condition that would determine whether or not we're going to play a game. And that means that we need a variable that is going to hold a Boolean value, so true or false. So we can say, should I play let's just do game. Should I play game? Now, this particular variable right here is now holding the value true or false. In this case, we actually assigned it false right off the bat. So let's not do that. Let's just give ourselves an empty variable. Of course, keep in mind in JavaScript, when you leave something empty because you plan on putting data in it later, it is always going to be undefined by JavaScript. And so keep in mind that that is the value of should I play game right now is undefined. So let's say somewhere down the line, the user fills out a web form. So we've got an HTML web page, it's on our website, and we are actually asking a bunch of questions, and we ask our user, hey, do you want to play a game? And then later on in our program, so we've got a bunch of stuff that happens right here as we execute our program. And then should I play game actually gets set to whatever the user provided us. And let's say in this case, the answer is true. All right. Now in our logic, in our program, we may have a statement that says if should I play game, and then in here, some code to execute if user wants to play a game. All right, so let's break this down really quick. Let's make sure that we really understand what's going on here. There we go. In our programs, there are a lot of times where we don't have the value that we need when we reach that code, or we haven't gotten it yet. So this result may come from a web form, an AJAX request, a web service, or something like that. And so we create a variable to store a value that we may get later on in our program that we then want to do something based on whether or not that value exists or doesn't exist, whether or not it's true or false in this case. So should I play a game? User fills out a web form in our example. The web form sets the value to true. And now we reach the if statement. So let's break the if statement apart and let's figure out what exactly an if statement does for us. So the if reserved word. The if reserved word, all it does is when JavaScript runs into it as it is executing a statement, it tells JavaScript, hey, get ready. We have a block of code, and that is what is within these curly braces. So all the code that lives inside those curly braces is going to be the block of code that is to be executed. So if tells JavaScript, get ready. We have a block of code that is all ready to be executed, and we want to execute it if and only if should I play games is equal to true. So should I play game has to be true in order for this to execute. Has to be true. If statements always look for the true result of whatever value is passed to it as an expression here inside of the parens. All right. So with that, let's say, like we did before, we've got ourselves a true or false, yes or no. And so if they did say, yes, let's play a game, then let's go ahead and console.log that they want to play a game. But we're probably going to use something later on. So we might actually have code here that says, well, select a game to play. So we might need to implement that. So let's go ahead and set this to a to-do to remind us that we need to implement that action, that code, in order to handle that. But just to make sure that this is actually working as expected, we're going to go ahead and output a message to our console to show us that, yes, it's working as we expect. So let's play a game. All right. Now, when we execute this code, we get let's play a game. And that is because should I play a game is a variable that holds the value true. And as we just discussed, the if statement is looking for a true value returned by whatever code is inside of the parentheses. So that means because the value is true with inside of this variable, when that variable gets called as the expression within the parentheses, true is returned. The if statement evaluates it as true, and therefore this code is then run. So pretty simple right there. All we're looking for is a true to happen in there, or as the result of an expression or a true value. Now keep in mind, this right here inside the parentheses is always an expression. In other words, it can be more than just a variable. It could be a glob of code. It could be a call to a function or a call to a method or a call to an object's function or method. And as long as the result that gets returned is a true or a false or something that equates to true or false, then the if statement will work. And it will either come in here if it equates to true, or it will bypass this code and continue on execution for the rest of the program if it equates to false. It'll just not execute what's in there. So that is the basic if statement using just a single variable that equates to true. And then of course we can verify by using false right here. Rerun our code, and you'll see that we got 0 output down here in the debugger. And that is because should I play game holds a false when this expression is run. It equates to false if didn't get a true. Therefore, the code in here is bypassed, never gets executed, and we move on. So if statements are super useful in our programming when we want something to happen in our program, but we only want it to happen if something previously in our program equated to true. In other words, there is some kind of a true result to a question posed, then we want this to happen. And if we look at our decision tree, we've got should I game? The answer was yes, then the action gets performed inside of our if statement, inside of the curly braces. If the answer is no, if it equates to false, then this never happens, this action over here. Instead, we move on to something else. And as you can see, when it was false, we got no output, which means the code inside the curly braces was not run. And we moved on with whatever else happens in our program. Hopefully that helps you understand an if statement, and I hope it's really clear. If not, make sure you go talk to your instructor, visit Stack Overflow, go to the MDN or the Mozilla Developer Network documentation and read up on the if statement.